Right? There were Saturdays. How are you guys today?
Woo!
Talking about it's gorgeous outside, and that's nice. Enjoy it. I'm sure till the nasty weather's back, right? Congratulations on, the way weather is. Last week we talked about a couple of things. So last week we talked about federalism on Wednesday, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about federalism today. We may get as far as talking a little bit about sovereignty. I'm pretty sure that Chief Hoskins will not be able to be here on Wednesday. I just talked to Councilmember Callison, and he said, I don't think so, right? So I don't know if that's going to happen next week or the week after. It's just not going to happen. We'll see. Yeah. But I would talk about federalism today. That means that on Wednesday I'm going to talk about civil liberties. So we're going to just go forward, and that way if the president can come in or Chief Hoskins can come in, then we can fit them in when that happens. All right. So there is a quiz, an attendance quiz up on Canvas. And if you look at it, the access code is all caps, Supreme, SUPREME, Supreme. This is an attendance quiz up on Canvas. It opened about 4 minutes ago. If you need to get into it, the code is Supreme, all caps, SUPREME. So this is what it is. This is the question for you. I tried to talk to you about this during class on Wednesday. And so which step do you think was most important in establishing federal supremacy over the states? Which of these steps do you think had the biggest impact? This is the right answer. This is your. Let's talk about federalism a little bit. A definition. It's a way that we share power between two levels or two systems of government. So we have national government and regional government. In our case, these are states, okay? There are 12-ish in the world. You can look at Google, you can Google it, and they'll say there are 25 federations. And they list some of them, and I say, that's not a federation. So basically in political science terminology, all right, 12 of them are federations where you have states that have sovereign power over certain areas and authority that is distinct from the federal government. Now, obviously, there are things that they share too. We'll talk about that, but there are about 12-ish federations. The Constitution grants powers to both states and the national government that neither can infringe upon. Okay, there are some things that states can do that the federal government cannot do. Okay. There are two other kinds of governmental systems. There's a unitary system. Most nations in the world are unitary systems. So that's somewhere between 170 to 181, depending again on how you're going to calculate this, are unitary systems. So with a unitary system, there's a central government that makes decisions, okay? And then there are units underneath them, but they may give some local power. You know, they may say, hey, you know, here in this city, you can make some decisions about city issues, but they don't have to, okay? And so units under them can just follow from that central government. There is one confederacy that is, anyone know? Switzerland is a confederacy. It has cantons. It's one of the reasons why in Switzerland women were not able to vote until 1971 across all of Switzerland. And this had to do with the fact that one of the things that we see in federal systems and confederal systems is we see that there is much more inequality across the states, across the provinces, the cantons, etc. And so this is an example of that. So as I pointed out, there was a power shift, right? The 5 steps that comprise your quiz today that is under quizzes on campus, and the password is SUPREME, SUPREME, all in caps. And we talked about those on Wednesday. So those 5 steps were the Constitution, Articles 1 and actually 6, not 5, the Civil War, the 14th Amendment, and the Incorporation Clause, in particular incorporating civil liberties. Remember, we talked about how prior to that, those fundamental liberties, so whenever I asked you guys what makes a democracy, you guys said things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right? Freedom of the press. This is what you guys, the majority of you said was most important, okay? Those civil liberties did not apply to the states. So states could enter your house without a warrant, okay? States could stop and seize what you have. States could keep you from practicing your religion. It's not until these rights were incorporated through the 14th Amendment to all people that the federal government was able to say, hey, states, you can't do that. Okay? You can't do that. So you see that the federal government steps in and starts protecting liberties because states were declining to do so. Now, if you guys think back to your anti-federalist, federalist arguments, the anti-federalists were arguing the exact opposite, right? They're saying it's the federal government that's going to suppress liberties, state governments protect liberty, okay? And at the time, with no Bill of Rights, state governments did have bills of rights and they were protecting liberties. That over time, we see that erode. So it's not until these are incorporated that we see civil liberties protected across the United States. We also talked about the New Deal, right? And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the consequences of the New Deal today. But the New Deal, remember, states couldn't deal with the Great Depression. They didn't have the resources. People were leaving some states like Oklahoma in droves because they had no livelihood. And so when we talk about the New Deal, we're talking about the federal government getting fiscally, in other words, with money, involved in states. And if the federal government is going to give money to the states, at some point they said, hey, if we're going to give you some money, you should do it the way we say to do. Okay? The modern civil rights movement, we talked about those liberties, right, that are incorporated in the 14th Amendment. Well, the modern civil rights movement is actually going to, again, go to the 14th Amendment and say, there is this clause in there that seems important. Do you guys know what it was? The Equal Protection Clause, right? And they said, this seems like an important thing, right? We passed it for a reason, to protect people, and we're saying that states have to protect people equally. And so we see that enforced because of the Modern Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65 due to the Modern Civil Rights Movement. Now, there are lots of developments that come from this foundation. Those are those 5 steps we talked about on Wednesday, and I'm just reminding you. But we have an expansion of federal interest and also expectations. So 2 things happen. One, the federal government grows exponentially, starting with the New Deal. I mean, it goes whoosh, okay? So there are all sorts of things that the federal government is doing that was not doing before. Prior to World War II, we did not have a standing army, okay? Just as one example. So in 1971, we had things like the EPA is passed, the Environmental Protection Agency. Do we have an Environmental Protection Agency in 1903? No, we did not, right? Though Teddy Roosevelt would have totally been in favor, okay? But this is another way that the federal government, in very particularized and specialized ways, is expanding, okay? And so since it's expanding, since it's saying we have this, you know, Congress has passed, President Nixon has signed into law, the EPA, and so we are going to enforce this, that means that they're also paying attention to things that they weren't before. Their interests grow. We'll talk about that later when we get to bureaucracy. But the other thing is that we, the people, started expecting more from the federal government, right? So we can think about various and assorted country songs, right, that say, for example, Mr. Roosevelt's going to save us all, right? It's that idea. The federal government is going to take care of this. And I heard that some of you in your classes, when you were asked about, hey, look, if there's a problem with your water, who do you go to? You said the federal government. Because that's what we expect, right? The thing that I want you to recognize while we're talking about federalism is this. That yes, the national government has more power. But local governments have as much power as we give them. And also, they're more likely to be responsive to us. Okay? For example, on the 14th of February, there is what? An election, right? For what? What's being elected?
For your local government.
Your local government, right? In Oklahoma City, in Norman, there are a number of elections that are coming up, okay? And you say, well, they don't even do anything. They build your schools. They take care of your roads. They set your property taxes, right? I mean, they do some stuff. They make sure that fighters have equipment. They take care of things like homeless shelters. They compete for resources and try to get more businesses to come to your city. All those things. They do all those things. States, for the most part, have a problem though. They tend to lack sophistication and they also lack revenue. Okay? And there's reason for this. One, the federal government, in its bureaucracy, has people who are experts, right? I will tell you that many of my former graduate students and many of my former colleagues go to work in specific areas for the federal government. People go to graduate school and they go to work for the federal government. They are less likely to go to work for state governments. Why? Yeah.
Because in the federal government, their position is specifically catered to what they need to, but if they were to work in state government, they would be assisting a lot broader aspects of the job.
That's a perfect answer, okay? There is a niche job that fits what my research does at the federal government level. In this state government agency, I'm gonna have to do 1,000 things, and one of them is the thing that I am most qualified to do, right? And I'm not gonna get paid as much, right? So the federal government has more sophistication, has more revenue, because state governments tend to go, hey, we're gonna cut taxes, right? Let's cut taxes, let's cut state taxes, and they keep doing it. The Oklahoma legislature has has a law in place that every 3 years,
Which law?
the one that reduces taxes by 0.5%,
Oh, yeah.
every 3 years, our state income tax goes down 0.5%. Were the people clamoring for a decrease in state income tax? No, our state income tax is something like, at the highest levels, 3.5%, right? It was pretty negligible. People weren't asking for this, but the state legislature passed this, and in order, this is important, in the state of Oklahoma, to increase taxes, to say, hey, wait a second, 1% tax isn't paying for things, right? In order to pass a tax increase, it has to pass by a supermajority in the state of Oklahoma. So, people like voting for tax increases? No, right? They're okay with the way it was. They didn't ask for it. They didn't necessarily need it. They even asked the legislature to, hey, halt this. It's gone down far enough. But states don't have revenue to do things because they keep reducing taxes in a way that keeps them from having the money to do that. And so it puts it in different places, right? They put it in different places. The tax, the fees, right? Oklahoma has a great number of turnpikes, in case you not noticed, right? More turnpikes than almost any other state, more road miles of turnpike. And the reason is because that's how we pay for all of our roads, that the federal government doesn't give us money for, right? And so at the local level, we pay property taxes, and those pay for these roads in the city, in the county. So they don't have the revenue to do sophisticated policy development, to implement it. And then finally, the Supreme Court is a final arbiter of who wins between states and the federal government. Now, the Supreme Court sometimes sides with the states, and sometimes states side with the federal government, but it doesn't matter. The point is the Supreme Court is the federal government. It's the one making the decisions. So when we talk about federalism in the United States, we have power sharing, which is a constant source of contention between the national government and states. Right? Tell me right now what the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, is mad about with the federal government. Just one thing. Immigration, right? What does Governor Abbott say? Stop letting people in, right? So in particular, Greg Abbott, by the way, is talking about people who are legally here, migrants, right, who have been given asylum in the United States for a number of reasons. Just so you know, if you apply for a citizenship in the United States, if you are come to the United States to live from Mexico, the average waiting time is somewhere like 10 years. I think that's probably the average is 10 years. You know, it used to be a little bit lower, 7, it's around 10 now. 10 years, right? So these are people who are legally coming to the United States. Greg Abbott says, hey, if the United States is not going to build a wall, we are, Texas, right? He also does things like puts people on planes and sends them out of Texas, right? What do you guys think? Can you do that? What's his position? Tell me where Governor Abbott is coming from.
He wants to win re-election.
Okay, he wants to win re-election. Power is always an issue, right?
Yeah, I just feel like he's on the side of, well, the federal government is not doing anything about the issue, and the state government is not trying to take control of the situation in their own way, and like that's the battle between the power structure when one side is becoming more prominent in power than the other. But that comes into the issue, like if they're not doing anything for a long time, like something has to be done.
then the federal government is not doing anything, right? So therefore, the state of Texas has the right to do. What's the other side? Yeah.
Also throughout this self-interested or from self-interest state of Texas,
Okay,
not looking at the perspective of the wider area of North America as well as other states.
okay, that's a great point. So he is also looking at the interest of Texas specifically. Okay, what's the other side? What's the other side? Any other side? Federal government has no defense? Has no position?
Like a national government.
Okay,
So why does Texas have the power to take away citizens from being part of the US?
okay, so the position is they have the right to be here under US law, right? Not necessarily citizens, but they have the right to be here under US law.
So we can't have this one part of the US state.
So you can't take people out of one state, so you're not allowed to be here, right? We have that specifically under the 14th Amendment, right? And then also Article 1 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power to make laws in regard to immigration. The states do not have that power. Right? And so this is a contentious issue, yes. Eric.
So since Congress has the power on immigration, does that nullify Texas's ability to build a wall? Because is it considered immigration or is it just considered a wall?
You know, there are some questions about what Texas can and can't do,
I
right?
think they can do anything. I mean,
This is true. There is the kind of Texas mindset that does exist.
Amen.
But can Texas build a wall along the Rio Grande? Well, there's some issues there. Number one, the Rio Grande also belongs to the United States.
Yeah.
So if you build a wall, it needs to be in the middle of it. So there's that position. There's also the fact that there is a wall. It's just kind of sophisticated electronic surveillance. It's not a pile of cars, for example, right? It exists. And so, you know, and it's a big question. It's Greg Abbott, for example, points to the fact that X tons of fentanyl was seized coming across the border. That indicates the federal government is actually doing its job, right? If the border patrol is seizing things, then they're doing their job, right? And so it's kind of a question, right? It's kind of a question of perspective, and does politics have anything to do with it? Of course it does. The national government, the states have grown more powerful as well, but the national government has grown more powerful than states. Normally, I would show you Marshall's view of federalism. It's a little cartoon with John Marshall, the first true Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The link is there, but I'm not going to show it to you right now. All right, so there's some key court cases. We did not talk about Marbury versus Madison. We'll talk about that with the district judiciary, but it essentially says the Supreme Court has, anybody know? Judicial review, right? That it has the power to say this law is constitutional or unconstitutional, or this is how the Constitution is to be interpreted, okay? So that's Marbury versus Madison. We talked about Gibbons versus Ogden and McCulloch versus Maryland. When we talked about those two cases, remember Gibbons, the right to travel, right? McCulloch is going to say, hey, the federal government's supreme, and also uses the elastic clause. If we have the power to do a thing, we have the power to do something that will help us do that thing, right? New Deal and civil rights cases. That there are lots of New Deal cases. I mean, there's like just look up the word steal under cases, and you'll find about 17 of them. But Hartford Land and Motel versus U.S. is kind of the seminal civil rights case having to do with that. And essentially it says this: the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce. Hotels are clearly in interstate commerce. Therefore, the equal protection of the laws allows, or the 14th Amendment allows Congress to make a law enforcing the equal protection of the laws to private industries that are in the flow of commerce. I want you guys to think about that really quickly. Can you name one item that you have on your person that is not, has not, will not, cannot be in the flow of interstate commerce?
Fruit?
Fruit? Potentially your fruit in your backyard.
My
right?
orchard?
But if I sell it to somebody, right? I like to go to the, what's the peach capital near here?
Order.
Porter. I go to Porter. I buy peaches along a roadside stand. That wouldn't necessarily seem like there's interstate travel, but I'm on a road, right? I stopped on the road. I'm traveling. Therefore, anybody can buy those peaches. Yeah. Huh? Your retainer in your mouth? You don't think it was made somewhere other than the state of Oklahoma?
No, I think it's just one of the other ones that I don't find.
But did you buy it in interstate commerce? So when we talk about that, obviously, most things fall under interstate commerce. The Supreme Court has made a couple of exceptions. And so let's talk about those. Garcia versus San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority. This is a case where the federal government said, and this is 1990s, and so they say you cannot sell guns or carry a gun within a certain perimeter of a school. Okay? And so they're arrested by local police on this federal charge. And the Supreme Court says that education is outside of interstate commerce. So you cannot make a law regarding education of children because it has nothing to do with the economic stability of that area. There were some dissents, right? Now, Prince versus U.S. goes along at the same time. There was also passed at the same time a requirement that in order to buy a gun, you had to have any idea? Background check. So you had to have a background check, but the federal system was not up at the time. And so that meant that local sheriffs were tasked with running these background checks for local gun places. And they didn't like it. They said, the federal government can't tell us what to do. And Supreme Court said, you're right. The federal government cannot direct local police. Okay? All right? Now, after that, we passed the Patriot Act, where federal government directs all local police all the time, and local police don't care. Why don't local police care when it comes to Patriot Act? What?
Who's gonna enforce it?
Who's going to enforce it? Well, that's part of it, right? But there's another big part to it, and it's money. Because the federal government said, along with that, and here's some swag equipment, right? And so police were like, yes, we will take the swag, please, right? Public policy, we see that there's a beginning of devolution, right? That means moving to create public policy at a local level or a state level. And so that's one way that states are saying, hey, we can do this. We talked about those ideas in terms of incubators, right? And then we have these unfunded mandates that states was very angry about. Probably the most famous unfunded mandate was the ADA. What's the ADA? Huh? The American Disabilities Act is absolutely correct, okay? So the federal government passes the American Disabilities Act and says all public places, and that includes, courthouses and state buildings and local council buildings and universities and schools and also things like restaurants, all public places have to be ADA compliant. Okay? And so what does that include? These are these, yes.
Wheelchair ramps?
Wheelchair ramps, that's the very first one, and it's the thing that courthouse has gotten most upset about, yeah. Handicap parking, absolutely.
Rest-
Restrooms that are accessible, absolutely, what else?
Elevators.
Huh? Rails, absolutely, like right here. Oh, rail on the outside for the, vision impaired, absolutely, okay?
Elevators.
Elevators, okay? This building, this whole part of the building that we're in for Adams was added on after the ADA. Why? Because there was no elevator to get to Adams. And so the elevator's here. Right? And so states went crazy. They're like, you can't do this, you can't make us do this. Because why? Because they hate people who have disabilities? Is that why? Because what? Because they suddenly have to put a lot of money that they don't have, right, into getting compliance. Okay, and the federal government does not provide money for that. They just say, do it, right? And this is also under the 14th Amendment. Okay, so that means equal access to this classroom. So for example, my PowerPoints are closed captioned, sort of, I mean, sometimes better than others. But they're closed captioned for those people who are maybe hearing impaired, right? The ADRC exists on this campus so that people who have more difficulty in different areas are able to get the same opportunities to get a degree and to study and take this class, right? Prior to the ADA, this was not a requirement, and it was not normal. So states also share powers with the federal government on many important policies. There's lots of things they actually do agree on. So getting back to that water example, right? EPA, the federal government does in fact have a Clean Water Act, okay? The state of Oklahoma has a DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality. And then localities are also responsible for water supply, right? And so they do things like arsenic testing. Don't worry, Norman hasn't tested super high in at least 3 years. So, I mean, they're doing better.
They got a big fine from the federal, they got a big fine from the federal government, didn't they?
They did get a big fine from the federal government. Because there's so much arsenic in our water.
And it's still brown.
But you know, little teeny tiny bits, it just makes it stronger. All right. So the point is there are things that they work together on, right? And states also work, when we talk about rivers, rivers don't stay in one state. They run through many. And so if you pollute one, then it shows up in another. And so states form compacts, say, hey, man, don't do that. And they say, well, all right, but maybe your air quality in this area, you could do it this way, right? And so these are ways that they do in fact work together. We also have recent increases in federal power, in particular the increase in the national police power. We see that because of the Patriot Act, that's been 20 years, which is weird. It's been 20 years, it's a recent increase. I know it's your entire life, but it's recent that the federal government has as much and as far reaching power as they do in terms of police issues. Family law issues is another place, right? States control all family law under the idea of morality, okay? But the federal government has said, hey, look, we're not just talking about morality, we're talking about equality, right? So Obergefell v. Hodges, which we'll talk about probably next week, says what? Does anybody know? Yes. People of same sex can marry each other, but specifically adults who consent to marry each other. Their marriage will be recognized in all states, right? And so it says really clearly this is an equality issue. And why is marriage an equality issue? Can you tell me? Yeah.
Because, I mean, isn't it still not technically illegal to have a forced marriage, like, on your child?
Yeah, that's a whole other issue. Yeah, okay, yes, but different issue. Okay. Yeah.
How to deal with the 14th.
Yes, to the 14th Amendment, absolutely. Because marriage comes with benefits, all right? You guys are thinking, I will be single for the rest of my life because I like being free. Well, guess what? That also has a price tag. So, I mean, the thing about being married is you get benefits, but it also means that if you love somebody, whether you believe in the institution of marriage or not, if you are married, that means you get certain benefits like being able to see them in a hospital when they're dying, which you don't get if you're not married to them. Right? Okay, so education is another place where the federal government has been more active in recent years. And by this, I mean, really since No Child Left Behind, and so again, another 20 years. This is, and I want to be clear, this is both Democrats and Republicans depending on the issue, right? Education is both, all right? So under George W. Bush, we talked about this. Under George W. Bush, No Child Left Behind gets put in at the federal, the national level, and they say, hey, here are some standards. Now, states have said, as it turns out, this wasn't such a great program, but it's such a tangled mess that the federal government is very involved with states trying to deal with it. And then economic bailouts. States, localities required economic bailouts after the recession of 2007, 2008. Okay, so in 2009, states and localities got bailouts, as well as large corporations, in particular the auto industry and the banking industry. Okay, but we also see economic bailouts more recently than that because of COVID. Yeah, COVID. So because of COVID, we had a pandemic. I don't know if you guys recall, it's still around, incidentally. Because of that, states did not have the resources to deal with that either. Localities shut down, and so the federal government gave money to states to disperse to their people. So they dispersed their people for the purposes of education, so that kids could get wired in. Gave money to individuals so that individuals could get wired in. And so tying into education again, but also these economic bailouts are part of that. There are big consequences. Because we have a federal system, states compete for resources, right? And so that means that they lower tax rates, or they give tax rates to corporations, or they build things for them so that they will come there and employ their people and increase the economic output of the state. That's the whole idea, right? But it takes away resources from citizens, because if you give tax breaks to corporations, that means that there's no tax income to provide for things like, education or health testing or things like that, right? Now, the idea is it's going to pay off, right? That's the idea, but it still happens. Road building is another. When we have roads that are specifically built for corporations, as opposed to, these county roads that maybe attention. Infrastructure is often targeted. NFL stadiums will sink a city. They are so super expensive that they will send cities into bankruptcy because cities have to build them, not the billionaire NFL owners.
We're about to build a new basketball one, aren't we?
Basketball arenas are different. Basketball arenas actually do increase revenue. It's NFL stadiums that really sink it. Baseball also does pretty well. Bass Pro Shops, generally a bad investment. Okay? So states may limit help to needy in many different ways. We talked about that before too. So we have several things. There's dual federalism. This is essentially what we have until the New Deal. Okay, so for the first half of our history, until the New Deal, and that is states are going to do this line of things, and the federal government's going to do this line of things. And so it looks like a nice, neat layer cake. Education, state. Foreign policy, federal. Police, states. Then we have immigration, federal policy, and then we have roads, states. Nice to meet, no crossover. After the New Deal, we have something that's known as cooperative federalism, also known as marble cake federalism, right? And so imagine that yellow cake with all the fudge bits all through it, right? And so your neat little layers are all confused. So if you're in the education realm, there's some federal government stuff going on. If you're dealing with an issue, whenever it comes to foreign trade, there's some state issues going on, okay? We have centralized federalism from 64 to 80. And during that period of time, this is really LBJ. He says, hey, we've just been giving you guys money and you're not giving it out equally. So that's when they start putting conditions on it. They say, hey, look, you can't give a no bid contract with all that ODOT money you just gave, guys, to your crony friend. You have to audit it and you have to have a fair and equal opportunity for everyone to bid on it. You can't be racist. You can't be sexist. Okay? You can't be ageist. Right? They also did things like, they said, as it turns out, 19-year-olds who have been drinking often drive their vehicles and kill people. So if you want some highway money, then you need to raise the age to 21 and to lower the speed limit to 55, early 1980s. The problems, as we've talked about, are things like unfunded mandates, and then there's cross-cutting requirements. You're required to do this for this education funding, but you're also required to do this to get the structural funding, and maybe they interfere with each other. New federalism, which we've seen since 1981 to 2001, it's about 20 years. It gave some power back to the states. See the space age in this other. States and localities are gained power, receive less funding from federal government. There's targeted block grants here. You wrote this grant. Now we're going to give you money and let you do with it as you please, because according to what you've written, you qualify, right? But these will always mix in with things that have federal policies too. So which is the best? I'm going to ask that question of you on Wednesday. I have one more thing to talk about before I let you go. Ad hoc federalism. So from 2002 to the present, there's been a mix of all of these things, with the exception of dual, because just you can't untwist it now. Okay? But there's been a mix of new federalism and also cooperative federalism. And it depends on the issue. And it depends on who's in power in the state in terms of who's going to argue for what, right? And so we have a lot of partisan stuff and political convenience where, for example, Bush v. Gore 2000, the Supreme Court said, oh, when we read the Constitution, it clearly says that states have the power, except for when we say that it doesn't. So in this case, we say that it doesn't. So Florida has to stop now. Okay, so it's partisan, power, convenience, but at the same time, we have interagency working groups on federalism, trying to deal with it. We have after 9/11, the Patriot Act, which is going to be a as we look at government